All right, let's look at the contemporary Latinx page together. How's that? The first image that you see there, you're going to notice it's kind of a funny digital image. I put it there because it shows the magical realism that you're likely to see in contemporary Latinx artwork. Magical realism is a blend of reality and fantasy, of kind of combining two worlds. Sometimes it's the spiritual world and the real world. Other times it's a world you left behind, your homeland, and the new world. So let's get started. The first image that you see of those bikes, Palante by Miguel Luciano, he is Puerto Rican. And when you look at this, I think you do a double take a little bit because you see real bikes, but they seem to be almost going in different directions but unable to. And this is a really great metaphor for a lot of contemporary Latinx Chicano artwork. Are you Mexican or American, Salvadorian or American? Palante means go for it. And it's this idea that you can, hop on your bike and try to resolve these issues, but in fact, you're going nowhere if you feel divided on it. I think it's also a good metaphor for our country right now with its sense of divisionism. On the next images that you see of Frida Kahlo, it is pretty much impossible to talk about contemporary art without talking about Frida. She was married to Diego Rivera, who did the mural that was on the previous page that you wrote about. And at the time of their marriage, he was an international, well known artist who did real socialist imagery on large scale murals. Frida at first was something of an unknown, and up until very recently, she wasn't even in the art history books. But as art history books have been including more people of color and more women, she's gained quite a bit of prominence. The first image you see is the Vogue portrait that she did. During the time that she was active, you know, women had to fit in. Women had roles that they were supposed to play. And unless you were an Anglo Eurocentric woman, then your place was not on the cover of Vogue. It was in the kitchen, as a maid, as a servant. And certainly women who wanted to be taken seriously dressed in a fashionable Eurocentric way, not in an indigenous way. Well, Frida really flaunted tradition in a major way and really embraced her indigenous roots. And by dressing in this way, she was seen as very exotic, but also very beautiful and fashionable. The second black and white image that you see of her that looks like she's in bed was an image that showed for much of her life she was in pretty severe pain because for much of her life she was disabled. When she was young, like 18, 19, 20 maybe years old, she was on a bus and in a horrible accident, and the pole that she was holding on to inside the bus pierced her body and went through her midsection, meaning it went through her uterus. So she was carried on the pole to the nearest pickup truck and taken several hours cross country to the nearest hospital because Mexico at the time was not as cosmopolitan as it is now. And she survived the journey and she survived the operation, but she was left unable to have children. She had a miscarriage. It was very traumatic for her. During this time period, most of Mexico was Catholic, and women were expected to, have babies and have families. And what happened with this horrific accident was, her whole future changed with her being disabled, and her whole image of what she was going to do with herself changed. And so she did start painting while she was in recovery, but all of her life she was trying to kind of deal with, disabled, indigenous, not being able to be a mother, being a fierce woman and independent, and what that meant to her. Now, in the previous page, I talked about and showed you retablos, the tin paintings that are a folk art form where when something terrible happens to you in Mexico, you do a tin painting about it, and you think whatever spirit or saint saved you from it. And usually there's writing on them, and it depicts some trauma that the person has gone through, and it's like a votive offering. Well, in Broken Column, you can see that Frida is dealing with her pain. She was in a plaster corset that went from her neck to her knees for gosh, I think it was a year, and then periodically thereafter, and you can see her broken body, and the landscape behind her that looks like it's broken and has gaps in it is kind of the landscape of her sin. When you see the self-portrait with cropped hair, that is done very much in the tradition of a folk art retablo, like you saw in the previous page. Diego, her husband, had an ego as big as his reputation and started sleeping with her sister and slept with a bunch of models. And this was just tore Frida up. So in defiance, she chops off her hair and starts sleeping with the models that Diego was sleeping with, and proceeds to sleep with all kinds of men and all kinds of women, and is angry at her sister and makes up with her sister. Well, I mention this because Frida during the 1920s is one of the more prevalent images of a modern woman. This idea of a modern woman who can cut her hair short, have her own life, be fierce, be independent, be powerful, not be, controlled by a man, have her own sexual appetites. So she was, if you know Georgia O'Keeffe, she's another woman who was like that during the 20s and 30s. And in fact, Frida Kahlo and Georgia O'Keeffe are rumored to have had an affair. She had an affair with Trotsky, who was a prominent communist. She didn't care that she was shocking people. So in Self-Portrait with Cropped Hair, it's her just kind of taking away her femininity and that feminine identity and just confronting what's happening with her. And the image of my birth, that's Diego in the painting above the bed as she gives birth to herself. You'll notice at the bottom there's a blank area. Traditionally in a retablo, that is where you would have had somebody write a supplication to a saint, thanking a saint for their intervention in something traumatic and difficult. And here you can see there is no thanking of the saints. There is no acknowledgement that she was helped along the way at all. This piece, on a personal note, I found interesting. I was giving a lecture a while ago on feminist artists and how they might have to give birth to their own image, that in creating their artwork they might be finding their own voice, giving birth to a new way of seeing or feeling. And I showed this as one of the first images because I thought it was such a powerful piece of a woman giving birth to herself. And two men at the back of the room just walked out. They were so disgusted by this. And I think it's really interesting that we're all born and we've all been through this experience, and culture tells us what a beautiful, thing this is to give birth and have a child. But any artwork that really deals with birth is honestly highly censored and usually locked away. Judy Chicago is a very famous feminist artist who did a birth project, and that was, taken off the market and not reviewed in magazines in much the same way that Frida was highly censored for doing this piece. The wounded deer that you see next to it is, again, Frida trying to deal with how wounded she was by Diego's infidelity. She really took refuge in her native identity. She was mestizo, mixed, indigenous, and Hispanic. And so she felt this real connection to nature, but she also felt like she was kind of a very odd person. She didn't quite fit in because she was, quote, a half breed. And so you can see this wounding in this piece that is kind of magical realism. In the two Fridas, you can see her trying to resolve this identity split even further. On the left, you can see that the heart is cut in half, and she holds a pair of surgical calipers trying to stop the bleeding from an artery, and she's dressed in a very Victorian, proper, lacy, feminine, female appropriate dress. And when she tries to cover up and wear this white dress with lace and be very rigid and precise, you can see that her heart is cut in two. The little flowers along the hem of the dress are kind of there, but the blood stains are making it. On the right, you can see her as an indigenous woman dressed in her kind of natural costume or dress, and her heart is whole, and she doesn't have to hold the surgical calipers, and she holds a small fetish in her hands. The unibrow that she has that looks like a bird, during this time period, women were expected to, shave their legs and pluck their brows. And Frida had a little bit of a mustache and definitely had brows that kind of went together. And that was another part of her defiance about natural beauty versus cosmetic beauty. Well, Robert Salgado is not a traditional Latinx artist. He's a contemporary Chicano Mexican American artist, and you can see that he has this kind of riff on the two Fridas. He's a queer artist and really talks about on his own Instagram and website and in his artwork about this mixed identity of both being displaced from his homeland and a Mexican American, and then coming from a Catholic background that doesn't want you to come out. So he's gay and he's Mexican and he's American, and he is like, I have been so silenced and displaced that it's in my artwork that I can speak most freely. We're going to be looking at some Chicano artwork where people who are oppressed and feel like they can't speak out through graphic posters, through guerrilla graphics. The reason they might not be able to speak out much like BLM protesters can speak out is because if they're undocumented, you're not going to speak out. You're going to get deported. So even though 80% of Mexican Americans in the United States are here legally, there is still 20% that are fearful about speaking out for their rights. So the next piece that you see is by Leonora Carrington, and she is a very well-known traditional magical realist Mexican painter who's very well represented, internationally known. The labyrinth or the maze has always been a symbol since Greek times of, finding your way in the world, of being lost, of emergence. You don't know when you get to the center of your being whether it'll be deliverance or the end of you. And you can see here that there's black and white, animal and human, right side up and upside down, adults and children. And so in this opposites, psychological opposites, male, female, day, night, Mexican American, you can see this tradition of magical realism where you're trying to resolve the opposition and bring it into some kind of unification. Orozco is another very traditionally known Mexican artists. The Zapatistas were peasants who rebelled against the harsh living conditions and this idea that you might be poor and oppressed by a ruling class or a higher, socioeconomic class, and you're protesting is very much a part of the Chicano movement. The Chicano art movement, Chicano being another word for Mexican American, the Chicano art movement really took place during the civil rights movement in the 60s, during the civil rights movement with the blacks gaining a voice, but also during protests with the Vietnam War. And that was because poor people go into the army because they don't have a lot of job possibilities. And it became very apparent during the Vietnam War that the people who went to the front were blacks and Mexican Americans. They started seeing the statistics on who was getting killed by being sent to the front, and it was always people of color getting killed at far higher rates than whites were being killed, because the whites might be held back for training or for safer missions. And so the Chicano movement starts during the civil rights movement, as that's connected to the Vietnam War protest. Now, whereas African Americans in civil rights were protesting the treatment of blacks, Chicanos joined the movement and they were protesting anybody who was oppressed or put down. And so, because the African American civil rights was so much about racism, the Chicano protests were more about oppression. Anybody who didn't have power, who was lower on the socioeconomic range, whether you were LGBTQIA or anything else, there was much more room in the movement. During the civil rights movement with African Americans, there was this question of, do we mix into white society? Do we have a separate society? How about black men, black women? During the feminist civil rights, finding women's rights, there was like, well, white women versus black women, gay women versus straight women. Chicano movement was like, if you're having a hard time with representation, come on, join the family, we'll include you. So I wanted to make that clear. Carlos Almaraz starts being a more contemporary Latinx artist. And I'd like for you to think about, why would he paint things like this? He painted things on fire, cars speeding down the highway that blew up into flames. And you'll notice here that there's people standing outside their cars just watching the fire happen. And you might say, well, here's this comfortable life, and people are just trying to have a comfortable life and live, and this house on fire is the destruction that happens, the like burning crosses on the lawn, this acts of violence and vandalism. It might be that our own house is burning down, our own kind of American house is burning down with conflict about immigration. This idea that somebody next door could have tragic and traumatic consequences in their life and everybody just stands by and looks is something that Carlos Almaraz plays with. On the Playing with Fire, Ana Mendieta is one of those artists that when you see her at first, you admittedly might scratch your head with a WTF kind of question mark and thought bubble over your head. You'll see her sole silhouette on fire, and then she's against a tree covered with mud, and the third image that I have for you is a silhouette that's filled with blood. Ana Mendieta is a Taino Indian coming from Cuba. And when Fidel Castro came into power, there was this idea that there's this ruling class, that the poor people aren't really getting a chance. Communism rises up, and Cuba becomes what it's been today. Well, when Castro comes to power, a lot of the people in Cuba didn't think it was going to last very long. They didn't think it was going to have long-lasting consequences, but there was violence in the streets, there was protesting, there was rioting. So a lot of affluent people sent their kids 90 miles north to Florida. And if you had a relative, great. If you were Catholic, you could go to summer camp, and the kids kind of went to summer camp or stayed with relatives for what they thought was going to be a couple of weeks, and it turned into years. And it turned out there were embargoes, so the families could not reunite. Anna Mendieta was one of these kids. So when she's quite young, she's sent over to Florida. She has nobody to sponsor her, and because her parents can't come and claim her or get her back home, she's shipped off to an orphanage in Iowa and ends up in foster care. Well, she feels like she just doesn't fit in, and as soon as she's old enough as a teenager to emancipate herself, she moves directly down to Key West, which is as close to Cuba as she can get in the United States. She originally starts building sandcastles as art. And what this kind of silhouette is that you see is in the Taino Native Indigenous belief system. It's Mother Earth, and it's a matriarchal society. And this pose that you see is the Mother Earth that's all life-giving, that nurtures you. She's an Earth Mother who protects you. And so Anna Mendieta would make these sandcastles in the form of this goddess image, and the water would come and wash the sand out to sea, and this was her way of sending her mother and grandmother a message that this image of the goddess would wash towards them with the ebb and flow of the water. Well, as she matured, she started using this theme quite a bit more, and she would lay her body on the ground and then dig these almost like graves for herself where her body would fit into them. And in the first one, she lit it on fire, and she would photograph it, but really the art was a performance art where it would be her body that would be the art, not some art object that she'd make. And these photographs are more like documentation of what she did. So she does this silhouette where she pushes herself into the earth, trying to connect with her homeland, with the soil, with this feeling of being indigenous and connected to the earth. And she sets it on fire. So this goddess is just on fire. The fire is set at the heart of the goddess. The next series of photos from this series is where the fire goes out and there's just smoke rising from this goddess image, and it very much looks like a ghost or a spirit. Well, she photographs this site over the next couple of months, and as you may know, in barren soil, if you have fire, it's likely to purify the soil and allow things to grow in it where the carbon and ashes are. And what you start seeing is this lush vegetation occurring where she has had this transformative fire ritual. This also happens in the blood piece. That's not human blood, it's cow's blood. But as the blood sinks into the earth, it's like the blood that's been spilled in wars, the blood that's been spilled by her ancestors, the blood that connects the goddess in a female menstrual way to generations of women, and how this blood is not something gross or disgusting, but instead the menstrual blood or the blood of your ancestors is a sign of being able to give birth to something new, to continue life, that life has not been destroyed. And so she photographs the blood series, the Sangre series, over and over again, where there's new life or new vegetation. The one where she's against the tree, she has taken the earth and rubbed herself in it until she's of the earth and part of the earth. And of course, trees are trees of life. And so she is trying to become one with the tree of life as she strives to reunite with her mother and her grandmother and her family. Spoiler alert, she finally did. Unfortunately, she was killed as a victim of domestic abuse. So the whole idea of women and being powerful is sadly cut short. He was a sculptor who was never held accountable. In the next piece by Luis Cruz, Azteca, you can see it's almost kind of like wildly funny but terribly horrible. And if you looked at some of the Mexican traditional folk art on the previous page, you would have seen this kind of lively pattern making and rhythms. The no parking refers to this idea that is there any room in America for immigrants? Is there any room for Mexican Americans? And the danger that happens as you cross the border and then you get here and nobody wants you, nobody allows you to be here. So you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you can tighten your belt, aka the image on your left. You can be like a dog with a bone trying to hold on, but you can see on the right the idea of death, the idea of suicide, the idea of desperation, the idea of going round and round and never really being accepted. I'm curious to think of what you think of Robert Lugo's work in the next series of images. You'll see Biggie, you'll see Tupac, you'll see other people that you maybe know. These are teapots. They're made out of porcelain. I thought it was funny. He is now a professor where I went to grad school, teaching in the studios I used to teach in. You'll see Tupac and MLK. Well, he uses porcelain to make teapots, and it's hard to think of something more Eurocentric than a porcelain teapot. You sip out of teacups with your little pinky up, and you're quite civilized, and it's a high degree of skill to cast and work with porcelain. He calls himself a ghetto potter. You can look him up. He's got a cool website. You can follow him on Instagram as well. He uses real gun parts in his piece combined with the porcelain. He uses mug shots. And then on the one with Biggie, you can see he's kind of using graffiti art, like art that you'd find in the ghetto, with this idea that when you're in the ghetto, you're always being resourceful, and the celebration of life, or the artwork that you see in the ghetto, here is fused in a really abrupt way with porcelain. And so he kind of combines this high and low aesthetic with violence and civilization, Eurocentric and Afrocentric. The last one that you see that is orange and black is taken after Greek vases from ancient Greek pottery. And Robert Lugo has a master's degree and knows his art history, teaches art history, I'm sure, at Temple University. And the Greek vases used to have like mythic stories of great warriors and the great deeds of warriors. And here you see that there is a same kind of pattern. You might have seen these in art history books or in museums. But here on the top, one of the top bands, you can see racial profiling. You can see, white profile, black profile. And then you can start seeing kind of a police man handcuffing a young man. You can see men having like these defensive postures, being thrown to the ground. And so this idea of being a warrior, of surviving, of who are our heroes, the police are the young black men. So Robert Lugo really raises some questions. And some of these questions are asked also in the Moratorium by Irizarry. This is more about the Vietnam War, and you can see that the moratorium is to please stop the war, that way too many people of color are killed in these conflicts. One of the things I wanted to point out was it looks like you're looking through window panes, as though you're kind of observing this, but you're also seeing it as though it's columns in a newspaper, like you're simply reading the images like it's simply news and not people. And one of the riffs that Carlos is using is on Pablo Picasso's Guernica, which is a 27-foot long painting that is about when Hitler came to power before World War II. He had to figure out how he was going to kill large numbers of people all at once. And the airplane had been invented but not used in warfare before. And prior to World War II, Hitler has the idea for carpet bombing. Carpet bombing is where you fly over someplace and you just drop one bomb after the other and you just blow everything up. Well, they had not really dropped bombs from airplanes before. Always before it had been mano a mano, hand to hand, right? And so you had to get your coordinates and figure out how you're going to drop bombs from airplanes. So one day in the town of Guernica in Spain, there was a group of people who in Guernica who had been protesting what the government was doing. And Franco was the dictator, and Franco's name was the Bull. And you see this twisted, weird bull on the left-hand side. And Hitler made a deal with Franco to use Guernica as this bombing site. And it was kind of about the size of Prince George or Dinwiddie. And one day, like at RBC, people were going to work at a hospital, going to market, going to shopping, going to school. And all of a sudden, these unmarked airplanes come overhead and just start blowing everything up. And in the space of 4 hours, almost everybody was killed. And the few people who staggered out started talking about what they saw. And in the news accounts, they were like, oh, it's the rebels, it's Antifa, it's, these leftist people. And and this was in the news accounts as propaganda. And as people started describing what they saw, they realized, oh no, these were, German soldiers. So you see the horse that means power in the middle of this piece, and the horse is all distorted and twisted, a weird distorted power. He's got a bomb in his mouth, like a torpedo-like bomb in his mouth, and he's trampling this person that has a broken sword. The woman that seems to be screaming and is holding her child on the left is based off of Michelangelo's Pieta. Pieta is the Virgin Mary when she holds the dead Christ. It means pity her. And the reason she looks like she does is because her face is distorted from her shriek of pain as her child lies lifeless in her arms. This is a very famous piece that deserves its own talk, but it's Latinx and not Picasso right now. So you can see that in the moratorium, they're talking about any kind of war becomes this idea of loss, of people sacrificed, of manipulation, of things falling apart. So I followed this by Emmanuel Martinez Altar for Farm Workers. And I wanted to point out that if you think some of this is history, or if you're not Mexican American, or you don't have friends or family that's immigrated, or Mexican American or Puerto Rican, and you think, this doesn't really have to do with me, I'm into xenophilia, Hispanics are the largest minority in the United States, more Hispanics than African Americans, so yeah, I'll look at this, but it doesn't have to do with me. Unless you grow your own food from your own garden, if you are buying your food at any grocery store, you are eating on the backs of Mexican workers, because most of the farm work, most of the stuff that gets picked in the United States is picked by Mexican Americans, and many of them are migrant workers, whether legal or not. And the conditions that they work under are so bad that nobody else wants to do the work. That's the reason they're doing it. And until very recently, for example, there were no porta potties in the field. You would just poop and pee wherever you were because you couldn't go to the bathroom and you couldn't take a bathroom break. So the Amazon peeing in bottles, yeah, that's nothing new. If you gave birth, you didn't have health insurance or have time off. So seriously, in the United States, women would give birth in the fields. So he has made this altar for farm workers that combines Christian motifs and indigenous motifs and offers up this spiritual altar for the sacrifice that's made by these migrant workers. And what you see after that is really starting to get to what a lot of Chicano Latinx artwork is like today. If you don't have a voice and you don't have much money, one of the ways that you speak up is by inserting things like posters on telephone poles, things on the back of buses, flyers being held out, posters on walls of abandoned buildings. So you can see here, welcome to America's finest tourist plantation, and it's on the back of a bus with a lady going, "What am I seeing?" The boycott grapes that you see here is a poster for the United Farm Workers Union, and you can see a guy that's kind of Mayan and strong and proud, but, Mayan no more, reduced to picking grapes for low wages. There's a lot of mix in Chicano graphics, posters, protest posters that make you kind of look at something and then go, hey, wait a minute. Much like, oh, I'm going to just buy Sun-Maid raisins. It's natural. It's California. And we looked at product design, didn't we? So we know that just might be a little bit of a propaganda influence. And you'll see that in this one, Sun-Maid raisins, unnaturally grown with pesticides and insecticides. Esther Hernandez is the graphic artist for this. And the picture on the right is, as you may know, the Virgin of Guadalupe, the patron saint of Mexico, appears in countless Mexican American and Mexican images. And on the one on the left, she's reimagined as throwing off her cloak of heaven, and Chuck Norris, she's going to kick some butt and protect people by taking care of them with a black belt. You'll also see this kind of weird mix of popular culture and an awareness of American culture mixed with Mexican or other cultures in Yolanda Lopez's work, Who's the Illegal Alien Pilgrim? That's from John Wayne and Westerns, compared to the same pose in an I Want You for U.S. Army. And of course, the artists are totally aware of what they're riffing off of. Well, I mentioned that in the next work that the Chicano art movement, especially the protest art movement, was very inclusive. And so a lot of the work that involves LGBTQ voice speaking out came out of the Chicano art movement. And so you'll see here that these are posters that are actually pretty big. And this artist is now in D.C. So you might walk through D.C. sometimes and see these on a wall, kind of like graffiti, but plastered up there like a big poster. And, the pinkness of it, the roses, this traditional female look, but roses have thorns. And so this female identity, the Virgin of Guadalupe is also known with roses. And you'll see this kind of background of femininity with this voice that is very, very powerful. I think it's interesting that it's unusual for the words to be in black. Often they're in white, which seems a little bit more like a whisper, but man, she's shouting it out. And so here you see Johanna Torino. She is definitely dealing with being both Chicana and lesbian and putting her work out there. And since she's in DC, you might see her work up when you go up there. one of the things that we'll see just next week, real quickly, is that murals have been very, very important in the Latinx art movement. The sense of family, the sense of community, the sense of not being able to speak out, but still loving color and pattern and music and beauty and trying to make your life more beautiful. There is a big tradition of mural making that goes back to Diego Rivera, who you saw in the previous page, and is really celebrated today. The Latinx community in making public murals has really paved the way for all kinds of communities to be able to express their own cultural identity and differences on the walls of their own community. So I wanted to put that in there because we'll be seeing a little more of it. The next art is at the bottom of the page. I included because they simply show different influences of different Americans. So you'll see Cervantes's Chicana, where you see both Mayan and American views. You'll see a piece by Juan Sanchez, who is Puerto Rican. You'll see Scheherazade Garcia, Dominican. And then at the end, Chizu, Salamondo, who's Japanese American. And I wanted to point out that when we talk about these cultures, it's not like you're just Mexican American. There's Afro Chicano, there's Japanese and Mexican. People have loved each other and combined their families. It's not interracial because it's the human race, but many cultures have mixed. And because the Chicano Latinx art movement is so open to having different influences and supporting different types of people, you'll often find these really intriguing mixes of different cultures show up. All of these artists have Facebook pages, websites, Instagram accounts, and are contemporary artists working today. One of the things that I found really, really exciting was that at the Museum of American Art right now is a big show on protest graphics and Chicano guerrilla graphic art. And on May 13th, there's going to be a live discussion where you can register for a free workshop and hear what these artists have to say, especially how can you be active and respond to issues in the world, in a digital world, because with digital imaging and social media, you can really get your voice heard. And so you can register for these workshops and listen to these people who are already doing it, like making justice posters. So you can see justice for Philando Castile and justice for Freddie Gray and justice for George Floyd. Well, there is some really cool stuff happening in the newly reopening Smithsonian Museum of American Art, which is right next to Chinatown, which is very cool and also has a Janet Eckelman in it. So if you'd be interested in any pursuing of that, I included it for you. Hope you enjoyed this talk. Bye-bye.